Hi, my name is Brett Pike. I'm sorry I can't be there in person today, but I have a lot of ideas about climate change that I'd like to share, so thanks for giving me an opportunity to present some slides remotely. Today I'm going to talk mostly about climate change and the risks it poses to California and why we have a unique role in leading the effort to minimize those risks. I'm also going to talk a bit about agriculture and transportation and other ways that humans affect the environment that they're a part of, but really adjusting all of these systems so that they put much less carbon into the atmosphere is going to be the unifying theme of this talk. So I want to start off just by reminding everyone how beautiful and diverse this state really is. It's 164,000 square miles, and it includes this wide variety of biomes. You have the mountains of Yosemite, these ancient coastal redwood forests, more than 800 miles of Pacific coast, this really beautiful desert landscape, and all of these lovely rivers and lakes. But there is a huge problem that poses a lot of risks to all of these environments, as well as all of the others around the world. Global warming. I suspect that most of you are familiar with this concept, so I'll be brief, but I want to just reiterate a couple of key points. The Earth is mostly warmed by the sun. Light travels 93 million miles, illuminates the Earth for a brief moment, and then reflects back out into space. The atmosphere extends about 20 miles up and acts like a blanket to trap some portion of that heat. The atmosphere is a mix of different gases, nitrogen and oxygen and so on, and some of those gases trap heat more effectively than others. The single biggest problem is carbon dioxide, or CO2, which is produced by the burning of fossil fuels. There's a lot of denial about climate change from people and corporations who profit from fossil fuels, but the underlying science is really not in doubt. CO2 levels in the environment were constant for at least 800 years and then began rising dramatically around the time of the Industrial Revolution, when humans figured out that they could burn coal and have street lamps and steam engines and so on. That's around 1850. It's shown by the red line here. About 50 years later, the average temperature started to rise. That's the blue line. There's a lot of natural variation from one year to the next, but the trend by now is really very clear. From 1880 until the present, 16 of the 17 warmest years have been after 2000. The rate of change we're seeing at present is about 10 times faster than anything we've seen previously. Some of the biggest problems that come from this warming are weather events that are more powerful and less predictable, and a rise in sea level due to thermal expansion and melting of the polar ice caps. It's difficult to prove, but many people believe that we're already seeing the effects of climate change. This is New Jersey, in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. The basic principle here is that warm water is more likely to evaporate, which makes for larger and stronger storms that travel further inland. On the West Coast, hurricanes are unlikely because of the direction that the Earth spins, but there are some other substantial challenges we're going to have to deal with. And unfortunately, the most powerful nation in the world is not going to do anything about it. This is the President of the United States, Donald Trump. He formerly was a reality TV star and the owner of a casino in Atlantic City that went out of business. Here he is campaigning in West Virginia. He's wearing a miner's helmet, and his supporters are holding signs that say, "Trump digs coal." He and his allies and supporters have consistently denied the very concept of climate change and are continuing to collect billions of dollars from dirty industries such as the extraction of fossil fuels and the waging of wars for oil. So what can we do? For now, I'd like to focus on 4 main areas and give a couple of ideas about how we can make progress in each of them. One is limiting carbon emissions. One is preparing for sea level rise. One is problems related to transportation, and the last is housing and the issues around suburban sprawl. This is just a 30-minute talk, so I can't go into great depth on any one of them, but I hope that if I catch your interest, you'll be motivated to pick up the platform of the California National Party, which is where these ideas were first described, and take a look at their plan in more detail. The fundamental mechanism of reducing carbon is to put a price on those emissions. California, since 2013, has had a cap-and-trade system that affects about 450 large businesses that produce about 85% of the state's greenhouse gases. As the name implies, emissions are first capped at their present levels, and then if companies reduce their emissions, they can trade their surplus credits to other emitters in exchange for money or other compensation. This type of program first stops CO2 emissions from increasing and then universally reduces the number of annual credits by a fixed amount per year. This type of program is scalable, as carbon credits can be exchanged across markets if certain conditions are met. Jerry Brown made this program a cornerstone of his tenure as governor and has integrated our carbon market with several others. He's shown here with Nicola Sturgeon, who is the leader of the Scottish National Party. I like this photo because I have no idea what Jerry is doing with his left hand. He's holding a pen in his right hand like a normal person, but then he's doing some kind of Vulcan mind trick to sign the document purely by psychic force alone. I think maybe that's why he was governor for so long. More recently, Brown connected California's carbon market with the Canadian markets in Ontario and Quebec. Brown is here shown signing a sister state agreement with the governor of Sichuan province in China to promote cooperation on clean energy development. I'd like you to take a moment here to recall that Donald Trump has instead imposed sanctions on China to make it much more difficult to import their solar panels. I think it's clear that, at least on energy policy, California and the U.S. really are pulling in two directly opposite directions. Next, I'd like to talk about planning for sea level rise. This is a striking photo of the San Francisco ferry terminal flooding at a particularly high tide. At present, this is an uncommon occurrence, but by the middle of this century, it is predicted to happen much more frequently. To give you a 30,000-foot view of the problem, here is a prediction of what goes under if sea level rises by 4 feet, which is about the average projection for the end of this century. The South Bay is the worst hit, with Palo Alto and Mountain View basically disappearing. But if you look, you'll see good-sized cities such as Fairfield and Martinez having some serious problems as well. Additionally, if salt water infiltrates this far inland, we lose the ability to use the Sacramento and San Joaquin deltas as a reliable source of drinking water. Like I say, there's a lot of room for error in these predictions. The range is typically from 1.5 to about 20 feet, and a lot of that depends on whether or not the polar ice caps melt completely. But 4 feet of sea level rise is the most common prediction for the year 2100. And here's the worst case scenario. If we get 23 feet of sea level rise, which is the high end of the predicted range, if CO2 is not checked and all of the polar ice melts, basically everything from Sacramento to Stockton goes away. We also lose Berkeley, Oakland, and most of the East Bay. The situation down south isn't quite as bad, but it's still obvious that this would be a humanitarian crisis of historic proportions, especially when you consider that New York and London and most of the world's financial and cultural centers are also located at sea level. So if we can't save everyone, what can we do to at least help ourselves? A seawall or floodgate near the Golden Gate Bridge is a very ambitious but necessary project to protect the Bay Area. Let's consider the scope of the problem for a moment. 2100 is usually picked as the endpoint because it's a nice round number and we'll all be dead then. But let's keep in mind that the process doesn't stop at the turn of the next century. The flooding we have in 2100 might still be a problem in the year 2500. Of course, there will be tremendous advances in technology between now and then, but if you look at how seawalls are built, the technology is not that different than what the Romans used to build their aqueducts. I think it's quite dangerous and really irresponsible to say, oh well, that's beyond my life expectancy. I'm sure the kids will come up with some new technology after I'm dead. Therefore, I don't have to change anything about my lifestyle. At the risk of stating the obvious, this will be a major undertaking. This is the Maaslands Barrier in Holland near the port city of Rotterdam. It is one of the largest moving structures in the world. Each gate is 22 meters high and 210 meters long, and it is designed to deploy when a storm surge of more than 3 meters is predicted. It took 6 years to construct. The Golden Gate Bridge is about 1.5 miles long, and the water beneath it is about 300 feet deep. I have no idea if this type of construction is plausible because I'm not an engineer, but I think it's important that we start looking at solutions to a problem that we know we're going to have in the next few decades. Moving right along. California, especially Southern California, is a car culture. But unfortunately, we really need to reduce our reliance on individual automobiles, at least gas-powered ones, so that we can make our society more sustainable. Promoting urban density is a big part of that, and so is public transportation. One idea that has been kicking around for years is a high-speed rail network to connect our major population centers with spurs to Sacramento, San Diego, and Las Vegas. This train would travel at speeds up to 220 miles per hour and could get from San Francisco to Los Angeles in about 2.5 hours. This is a controversial proposal, but I really think it's the way of the future. It's much simpler and more comfortable than flying, and the carbon emissions per passenger per mile are radically reduced. Another area of interest is autonomous vehicles, shown here using some kind of radar to avoid crashing into one another. The CNP platform calls for the establishment of a cabinet-level Office of Innovation that would administer an innovation fund to support research into new sustainable technologies such as this one. Licensing these technologies to private companies would enable the fund to be self-sustaining, and those licenses would be discounted to California companies to encourage them to be based here. Also, making the use of bicycles safe and convenient is a high priority. There's been a lot of progress in well-marked, painted bike lanes, including right here in downtown Sacramento. But what we'd really like to see is dedicated bicycle lanes separated from traffic by a curb or other hard boundary. This kind of infrastructure makes it much less likely that a driver will turn left in front of you or that you'll get doored by somebody exiting a parked car. Our platform calls for making this a requirement for new developments and retrofitting such arrangements to roads that have high levels of bicycle traffic. An issue that goes hand in hand with transportation is housing. The one point I'd like to make about urban centers is that we are encouraging California cities to participate in the C40 project. C40 is an international organization that develops strategies for reducing the carbon footprint of big cities. At present, San Francisco is a member, and LA has put together a steering committee, and they'll be collaborating with 90 other cities around the world to share best practices for creating sustainability and a high quality of life. We hope that in the future, their experience can filter out to other cities in California to address the issues such as traffic, suburban sprawl, and the various types of pollution that can contribute to high carbon lifestyles. Agriculture is another significant way that humans interact with and modify the environment around them. Pre-modern agriculture was mostly harmless. But since World War II, the rise of mechanization and various advances in chemistry, such as fertilizers and pesticides, have made the act of farming much more damaging to the environment. So just as a broad approach to reducing this, we'd like to incorporate farms into the carbon market, so farmers can be rewarded for changing their practices in a way that reduces or even eliminates their carbon footprint. I'd also like to point out that California's agriculture is extraordinarily diverse, especially with regards to fruits and nuts, and many of these crops are more sensitive to small changes in climate than commodity crops such as corn and soybeans. I think the best example of a crop losing value due to climate change is grapes, specifically wine grapes. There is no other crop where the price can range from $2,000 a ton to $10,000 a ton, based solely on subtle differences in how it smells or tastes. The Napa Valley is widely regarded as the premier grape-growing region in the world, but if temperatures rise by even 2 or 3 degrees, there's no way to guarantee that status will continue. This map shows some predictions about how vineyards may have to relocate between now and 2050. The good news is that Trinity County might get some much-needed diversification of its agricultural base, but in this model, Napa is a goner. At present, the grape harvest is worth about $6 billion each year, which places it third in value behind dairy products and, of course, cannabis, which continues to be the most valuable crop in California. Another big topic I want to touch on is genetically modified foods. These are widely regarded as safe in the scientific community. I work with genetic engineering techniques myself, but there are many people who object to them. So what we are proposing is a system of voluntary labeling where producers can use a third-party trust mark to indicate that their foods are free from GMOs. My guess is that the non-GMO project is the default choice in that regard. This splits the difference between requiring producers to label GMO foods, which implies a safety issue that has not been shown to exist, and banning labeling altogether, which denies consumers the right to avoid GMOs for whatever reasons they may have. I know genetic engineering is a complex and controversial topic, and we could easily spend an entire conference talking about it. I'm not an expert on the legal and political implications of GMOs, so if you want to know more, I'd like to refer you to a book written by a colleague of mine at UC Davis, Professor Pam Ronald, and her husband, Raul Adamczak, who's an organic farmer. This is the second edition of their book, and one of the new chapters is about anti-vaxxers in Marin County and how they experienced an outbreak of whooping cough as a result. I just want to share with you one bit of evidence about why GMOs can be so helpful. This is a rice paddy in Bangladesh, which is a low-lying country where they experience a lot of flooding. And with climate change, that problem gets worse. On the right is a strain of rice called IR64, which is kind of growing back 80 days after being completely submerged for I think 7 days. On the left is that same strain with just one gene added, a gene from rice called SUB1 that helps the plants to survive the submergence. As you can see, that paddy is going to produce a lot more rice than the one on the right. Subsistence farmers in Bangladesh are some of the poorest people in the world, and they really need all the help they can get to grow enough rice to feed their families. This is not Roundup-ready rice, where you have to purchase a proprietary agrochemical to get the benefit. It's just a matter of planting the seeds and seeing what comes up. This is an extreme example, but there are many other situations where farmers might like to have a single gene added to a strain that they're already familiar with. So a topic that frequently comes up in the context of California independence is how much of the state is actually owned by the federal government. and why their claim to that land is in some ways suspect. I want to show you a couple of reasons why reclaiming control of our land is important for specific reasons relating to environmental protection. Trump wants to drill. Trump wants to mine. Trump wants to log. Obviously, the feds are showing a strong willingness to degrade our environment in order to line their pockets, with their typical disregard for long-term environmental consequences. I know a lot of people see Trump as an aberration, but this is the same thing that happened under Ronald Reagan when James Watt was the Secretary of the Interior. It's absolutely the standard practice for American conservatives to extract hydrocarbons and all other natural resources as rapidly as possible, and we have to put a stop to it. Our platform calls for a complete ban on offshore drilling. This is a controlled burn of oil spilled from the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. Just consider for a moment that releasing this giant black cloud of CO2 and toxic soot into the atmosphere is considered the best way that we have to deal with these kinds of spills. We also call for a ban on fracking, which is the use of pressurized liquids to fracture the earth and liberate hydrocarbons from dirty tar sands. This is a map of Oklahoma that shows the frequency and intensity of earthquakes before and after fracking was introduced. The larger the circle, the stronger the earthquake. In my opinion, California already has plenty of seismic activity, and doing something that we know will make it worse is just asking for trouble. I know this is a long talk, so this is a list of other common sense environmental protections that the California National Party would like to see put into practice. One is to put a price on the value of the services that nature provides to us, which on the one hand is kind of a meaningless exercise, but on the other, it can make some decisions easier. For example, if a land developer says, I want a permit to build condos on the waterfront that will sell for $6 million apiece, if we can say, well, the flood protection that's provided by that marshland is worth $100 million, then that permit will not be issued. This is a way that we can respond to the perspective that land only has value once humans have modified it. Next is a mechanism to pay people not to degrade land that they owned. This is a concept that was pioneered in Brazil, where for a while they were losing huge, gigantic tracts of primary rainforest to create cattle farms. And this is the jungle that takes more carbon out of the atmosphere than any place else. The Amazon rainforest really does act as the lungs of planet Earth. Beef farming is not super profitable, but just owning a piece of rainforest isn't profitable at all. So there was no reason for landowners to not cut down everything in order to raise cows. But it turns out that fairly small cash payments are enough to keep the rainforest from being slashed and burned, and we think that's an idea worth pursuing in, for example, coastal redwood forests or other places where endangered species live. Along those lines, we want to end the practice of clear cutting. There will still be regulated harvest of mature trees on public land, but it will be done in a way that enables the forest to continue providing habitat for various birds, animals, and even fungi and insects that may be at risk of extinction. Okay, so wrapping up. So I started off by posing the question of what can we do when facing these large-scale, long-term, heavily entrenched, seemingly intractable problems. And the truth is that you can't just flip a switch and fix any of them. But we can set a course for the future and then try to kind of stagger in that general direction. In the case of fossil fuels, we can replace them with renewables, most likely a blend of solar, wind, and hydropower. Kevin De Leon has put forth legislation to go 60% renewable by 2030 and 100% renewable by 2045. That's with regards to electricity. The California National Party intends to fully support legislation of this type. We probably won't experience a tsunami like this one from the film San Andreas, but to address a steady rise in sea level, we can design a world-class system of floodgates to regulate the flow of the Pacific into and out of the San Francisco Bay. This is a massive project, but it could protect millions of homes for perhaps hundreds of years. We don't know if the sea level is going to rise 4 feet or 14 feet, but in any case, we need this kind of infrastructure to protect what is without a doubt some of the most valuable real estate on the planet. Next, we can address the environmental and other impacts of traffic by developing public transportation infrastructure, such as this hub in Anaheim that opened in 2014. It's an Amtrak station that co-locates with light rail and local buses as well. If we succeed in building a high-speed rail network, you might be able to get from here, Sacramento, to there in less than 4 hours. Finally, we can address the housing crisis by promoting mixed-use, medium-density development. When you can walk out your front door and find a variety of shops or restaurants right there on the same block, or ride your bicycle across town, knowing that there's a hard boundary between yourself and the automobiles, that makes car-free living a much more viable lifestyle choice. So that's all I have for today. I'd like to thank you for listening. And the final point is, I just want to ask you to consider, what if I'm completely wrong about all of the things that I've just described? This is a cartoon from a couple years back, where there's a fellow with a podium who's talking about clean energy, livable cities, clean water, and so on. And there's a fellow in the audience saying, what if this is a big hoax and we make a better world just for nothing? And that's essentially the argument that Trump and his allies are making, that climate change is just a joke or a hoax, and all of these scientists across the world are fabricating all of these results about how terrible it's going to be. But even if the projections for the weather 100 years from now are not perfect, there's still a lot of quality of life that can be generated by pursuing this less energy-intensive way of living. And I think it's something that you see in certain places. San Francisco is probably the most famous example, where when you have walkable neighborhoods and public transportation, everybody wants to live there. And when you expand out of that, you just end up with this suburban sprawl of suburbs and strip malls that is really kind of soul-destroying, in my opinion. So I think there's a lot of reasons to change the way that we use the land in this state. And I hope I've given you some things to think about. And thanks again for listening.